Time. Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon for wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us for this Coordinating and Disseminating Research on Environmental Effects of Marine Renewable Energy, this webinar this morning. My name is Andrea Copping. I'm with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. We have a team of our group here, and also representing Ocean Energy Systems Environmental. Next slide, please. So we're really here today to do two things. We're going to give you a short update on some of the work that Ocean Energy Systems Environmental has been doing over the past year, which we do about annually. But we are particularly pleased to have two very eminent speakers here today, giving us some insights on two of the key stressors that the research community is working on. Next slide. So today, I'm going to give you a quick overview of OES-Environmental, but really focusing on some of the additional work we've been doing just this past year. There's a great deal more to be had on TETHIS, which I'll point out to you. And then we have two acousticians, as a matter of fact, using their training on two very different aspects of looking at potential effects of marine renewables on the marine system. Joe Haxel will be using passive acoustics, listening for sound in the ocean, and Doug Gillespie will be using active acoustics to really look at what animals are doing in the vicinity of turbines and other devices. Next slide, please. Many of you have probably heard and seen this many times, but we represent Ocean Energy Systems Environmental. This is a task that, oh, are we having trouble? Marley, it sounds like they're having trouble with audio. Are you guys hearing okay? All right.
I can hear you.
Yeah. Kayla says that from Forrest says that they're okay. Several other people say they can hear okay. Kayla, I hope you guys can get it fixed. Sorry. So Ocean Energy Systems is a group brought together under the International Energy Agency of countries that have an interest in developing marine energy. And in 2010, they lit off this task, OES-Environmental, to look at environmental effects of marine energy development for a number of reasons, but it really boils down to trying to move this industry forward in a responsible manner. This particular task is led by the US. The different tasks, countries, you'll have a lead country and then a number of countries associated with it. It's led by our Department of Energy and implemented by our laboratory. And right now we have 16 countries involved. You can see the flags down there. The big thing we put out is our State of the Science report. And this is a picture of the 2021, and we're deep into preparing the 2024 one now. Next slide, please. So marine renewable energy, I think we all are here because we know it's the energy harvested for the movement of waves, tides, currents, but also gradients from temperature and salinity. It's early stages of development deployment. And so we do still see, however, even 10, 12, 15 years on, that environmental concerns are still slowing consenting or permitting. We've really boiled it down to these 7 major stressors. And the two we're going to be talking about today with Joe and Doug concern collision risk and potential effects of underwater noise on animals. Next slide, please. So just to kind of go over some of the things we've put a lot of focus on. I think many people online here are familiar with TETHIS, our online knowledge base. We've put a lot of focus on adding additional tools, as well as the over 4,000 documents that are specific to marine energy. I remind you that it also covers wind, both land-based and offshore wind. But we've had a lot of extra tools added and upgraded recently. Of course, you can go there to find any past webinars. Our metadata, as we call it, are really records from the beginning of from 2010 on of any device that's been in the water for which environmental samples have been collected. Many of those, as you can guess, are no longer in the water, but we do have records of where you would find those data. We've worked on our risk retirement process, which is our whole string of how to apply data from collect data and apply it from one development or one deployment and add it to another. We've also got a number of educational resources I'll show you. TETHIS Blast, if you haven't signed up for it, is our every other week email newsletter. Next slide, please. So the big focus we have at the moment is working on the 2020 State of the Science report. We're changing this up a little bit. We're really focusing on what information has been generated since 2020, the key stressor receptor interactions, risk retirement, et cetera. Yeah, somebody could list those stressors in the chat, please. We're also focusing a lot on more on human dimensions of marine renewables, social and economic effects. How does stakeholder engagement enter into both looking at environmental effects and how this can drive consenting? We've also got new focus areas where we're really trying to move from what do we think about single devices and how would this inform what we understand of environmental effects around arrays. There is a paper on scaling up that has just been published. We have one on cumulative effects and one on ecosystem-wide processes. We also have a paper just submitted on displacement, which was sort of the seventh of those stressors, and that is the idea that many devices at sea may cause displacement of either migratory animals or even maybe benthic organisms that can't get across cables, etc. Other new focus areas include looking at tropical and subtropical regions. We have tended to be, I think, as a community, very temperate and really northern hemisphere focused. So we're trying to really look at how tropical and subtropical ecosystems may differ in the effects that they see from marine energy devices. We will have a full draft of the State of the Science in the spring, June, May or June, and the final will come out in fall of 2024. Next slide, please. We have an educational resources page up on TESIS, and we've put a lot of new information there if you haven't been there already. We try to really focus all the way from, you know, sort of preschool, young school children, all the way up through graduate students. And we have a number of resources there. One of the new ones is we have a video game, Marine Energy Adventure, Collision Risk, Choose Your Own Adventure up there. That's just got fish in at the moment, but they'll be working towards marine mammals as well. Okay, next slide, please. And just to kind of, you know, what are we trying to move towards? We really are trying to beef up our public sharing of information in every case. Our management measures tool is an integration of all the monitoring and mitigation methods that have been tried, with some with mixed results, but we've documented all of that. Worked on data transferability and risk retirement, guidance documents, trying to take the science to the consenting realm, and really tried to look at a systems approach. And we'll bring all that together in the State of the Science. And I think that's it for me. I did forget to note that we are recording this session as we do all our webinars, and it will be available on TESIS later on for you and your colleagues to listen to and watch. In addition, if you have questions, particularly throughout Joe and Doug's talks, could you please put them in either the Q&A box, preferably, or the chat, and we will get to answering those at the end of the session. Okay, with that, next slide, please. We are first going to hear from Joe Haxel. Dr. Joe Haxel is the principal investigator of the Triton initiative at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and works on a number of active projects where marine renewable energy development is underway, really trying to understand what the noisescape looks like. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Joe.
All right. Can you ever hear me? Okay. Yep. Good. Thanks, Andrea. As Andrea said, I'm the PI of the Triton initiative here at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And Triton is a U.S. Department of Energy Water Power Technologies Office project that, as Andrea touched on, is focused on research, development, and validation of technologies and methods for understanding environmental effects around marine energy. So today I'm going to talk about sound emissions for marine energy converters, and more specifically, how we measure and characterize sounds using technical guidance from an international engineering standard. And then also talk a little bit about how those analyses from the standard can then be translated to the regulatory criteria here in the US. and used for future permitting and licensing deployments of marine energy converters. Okay, next slide, please. So, but first, let's start with a little background on why we care about underwater sound emissions from anthropogenic activities like marine energy and coastal and riverine environments. Sound is a primary sensory modality for many marine species. Marine mammals, fish, turtles, and some invertebrates rely on sound, sound pressure, or the particle motion component of underwater sound for critical life functions like foraging, communication, navigation, and predator avoidance. So sound that is introduced into the underwater environment from anthropogenic activities needs to be evaluated for its potential impacts on these animals. That said, relatively few marine energy converters have been deployed in the US, and uncertainty around the potential for acoustic disturbance from these devices stemming from a lack of consistent standardized data collection and analysis has resulted in significant challenges for permitting and expensive extended timelines for deployments. So how can we address this challenge? Really through best practices guided by technical standards. That's one important way. Those standards that provide consistent data collection and analysis that is cost effective, meets the regulatory needs, and promotes transferability, like Andrea mentioned, of the results between the marine energy sites. So collecting these data and gaining a better understanding of the noise emissions from the devices once they're deployed is part of the critical path for removing barriers for the marine energy industry. Next slide, please. Fortunately, we have these technical guidelines now. In 2019, the International Electrotechnical Commission, or IEC, released a technical specification 62600-40, acoustic characterization of marine energy converters, which I'll refer to throughout the rest of the presentation as the -40. The -40 provides guidance for hydrophone instrument fidelity, including sensitivity, bit resolution, bit depth, and sample rate. Specifies measurement zones with respect to the marine energy converter, recording periods for different levels of device characterizations, so level A versus level B, essentially short snapshot type measurements, or long-term data collection through a variety of environmental conditions. Specifies supporting data, including device power performance time series, wave heights, current speeds, and surface winds that can affect the acoustic measurements, and then guidance for the data processing, analysis, and reporting. So I really want to reiterate how valuable having a technical specification to work from is. The -40 provides a consistent and repeatable framework for detailed characterizations of sound emissions for marine energy devices. This results in meaningful measurements and an assessment of underwater noise stressor associated with a device through a range of power generation states and environmental conditions. This is really valuable information for a developer that they can take with them to their next deployment, informing regulatory concerns and potentially accelerating their permitting process. Next slide, please. So as helpful as the -40 is that I was just talking about for characterizing sound emissions from marine energy converters, regulators are charged with assessing the impact of acoustic disturbance on the animals. And in the case of marine mammals in the US, they utilize the NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service technical guidance for assessing the effects of anthropogenic sound on marine mammal hearing. This federal regulatory framework is organized into frequency-specific hearing groups of low, mid, and high frequency cetaceans, and then phosid and otariid pinnipeds. Each of these 5 hearing groups uses specific auditory weighting and exposure functions specific to their group to calculate an onset for permanent and temporary threshold shifts that are then associated with either impulsive or non-impulsive acoustic signals. The NIMS thresholds are defined with respect to sound pressure levels, and with some additional processing, The -40 metrics that I mentioned earlier can be translated to this NIMS criteria. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to share an application of the -40 and NIMS thresholds from a recent marine energy converter test off the southern California coast. In September of 2021, CalWave deployed a scaled version of their X1 WEC off the Scripps Pier in La Jolla for an open ocean pilot demonstration. The X1, it was a very successful test, and the X1 operated 99% of the time over the next 10 months until it was recovered in July of 2022. During the WEC deployment, CalWave collaborated with PNNL, Integral Consulting, and the University of Washington for acoustic measurements of their device using 3 different passive acoustic technologies: fixed bottom-mounted hydrophones, a vector sensor array known as the noise spotter, and a drifting hydrophone system from University of Washington known as the DAISY. Integral and University of Washington performed measurements at the same time over a period of a little more than a week early on in the WEC deployment. And our PNNL hydrophones were deployed in February of 2022, recording data over the next months, and then were recovered in May. Okay, next slide. The map on the left shows the spatial positions of the 3 PNNL hydrophones as the green circles with respect to the CalWave WEC, which is the yellow square kind of underneath the green circle 3. The Scripps Pier is visible on the right with the blue diamond anemometer station measuring wind speeds, and the red diamond further offshore is the buoy station measuring wave conditions at the site. Bathymetric contours are also shown in the map at 10-meter intervals. The hydrophones were deployed at 100 meters and 200-meter distances from the WEC in the longshore direction, while a third hydrophone was placed in the cross-shore direction, 20 meters inshore of the WEC. This was a departure from the -40 technical specification after some information that was shared with us from Integral and UW measurements indicated that the signals from the WEC during their testing were really low amplitude. So with approval from CalWave, we deployed the third hydrophone in much closer than the 100-meter distance that was called out for in the technical specification for that cross-shore measurement zone in hopes to better capture low amplitude signals from the WEC. The image on the right, taken by the Scripps divers that were helping support our work, shows the hydrophone lander system that we used. An Ocean Instruments Soundtrap 600 HF hydrophone was mounted in the center of the lander with a sensor height 1 meter above the seafloor, as defined in the -40 specification. And on the left side of the picture, you can see a pop-up buoy acoustic release recovery system that we had mounted on the lander. And this allowed us to not only recover the system by sending an encoded acoustic signal from a transducer suspended over the side of a surface vessel that then would release the float and recovery line, and we could pull the lander up onto the boat. But that unit also allowed us to acoustically survey in the geolocation position of the lander using that same transducer over the side to within about a couple of meters of horizontal accuracy. So we were very confident in the positions where we put these down. So one more important thing I'd like to mention is to pay attention to the station numbers in the map. These are associated with the hydrophones, and I'm going to show you data from these in subsequent slides. So particularly station 3 being the hydrophone that was 20 meters inshore of the WEC. Next slide, please. So what did we learn? We started with processing the long-term spectral averages for each station. This is a spectrogram image. And for those not familiar, the horizontal axis is in days over the recording period. The vertical axis is basically the frequency units in hertz. And the color map represents the acoustic energy in decibels, with hotter colors containing more energy. The LTSAs show basically a summary of the average received levels in discrete frequencies up to 10 kilohertz here at 100 meters from the WEC over the duration of the 4-month acoustic recording period. And you'll notice the majority of the energy is in the low frequencies, less than 1,000 hertz. And this variability is mostly associated with changing wave and wind conditions, as I'll show in more detail in the next slide. And also a little difficult to see here, but there is a rising trend in low frequency sound levels over this 4-month period. Next slide, please. So here, the top panel shows the wideband sound pressure levels recorded by each of the 3 hydrophone stations over the 4-month recording period. The lower panel shows the corresponding wave height and wind measurements taken by those instruments. I showed in the map earlier. And first thing is, you'll notice station 3, the 20-meter hydrophone, consistently has the highest sound levels, while the 100-meter and 200-meter hydrophones further away appear equivalent. They basically map over each other and are lower amplitude than station 3 at anywhere between a few dB up to about 5 or 6 dB. The second thing to notice in these figures is how sound pressure levels track with increasing wave heights, and they do this more closely than with changing wind speeds. And then lastly, the overall rising trend in wave heights. So you can see that black line in the lower panel sort of rising up throughout the deployment is accompanied by a similar trend in the sound pressure levels. Next slide, please. So this is these are dash 40 plots for each hydrophone. For each hydrophone station, sound pressure levels as a function are binned as a function of wave height and wave period. Wave heights are on the vertical axis, wave periods on the horizontal axis. And again, the color map represents the acoustic energy in dB. And so you'll notice for the 100-meter and 200-meter stations, 1 and 2 respectively, these look nearly identical and show a rise in sound levels with increasing wave heights that is not significantly influenced by wave period. Meanwhile, at station 3, 20 meters away from the WEC, not only are the received levels higher amplitude than at station 1 and 2, as we saw in those previous plots, but there is a distinctive pattern in the sound pressure levels that emerges during specific wave conditions. So at station 3, as wave heights increase, sound levels also increase, but notably, as the wave periods grow longer at those same wave heights, the sound levels near the WEC decrease. So this is an interesting pattern that is likely tied to the operational characteristics of the WEC. We're currently working on mapping the sound pressure levels at each hydrophone with the WEC power performance time series that CalWave has provided us. And we want to correlate the sound emissions with the power generation state of the WEC. So this will characterize the acoustic signature of the WEC through a range of environmental conditions and power performance. Okay, next slide. So now that I've shared some of the dash 40 analysis, these figures show the differences between the dash 40 mean sound pressure levels and the NIMS hearing group calculations for sound pressure levels. The blue line at the top is basically the IEC-40 sound pressure level wideband calculation. And this is consistently the highest amplitude when compared with all the NIMS hearing groups. So the NIMS hearing groups represent the other colors that are lying below that dash 40 line. The low frequency hearing group is the next highest amplitude, as should be expected, and the other hearing group time series line up more closely together with alternating periods of divergence at particular times. So, and also note that all these levels remain consistently below the threshold criteria for TTS and PTS. Next slide, please. So getting close to my time, but I've only just touched the surface here, showing a few summary type figures. But for more details about the spectral characteristics of the WEC generated signals, the sound pressure levels as a function of device power generation state, as I mentioned before, and many more kind of neat details from this work that we've learned around the CalWave WEC. We have a paper in draft that we're planning to submit by the end of the year that hopefully will be published in 2024. And I want to thank my co-authors here who have all been integral in collecting data and a lot of the analysis. Next slide, please. So thank you for joining. As Andrea said earlier, appreciate any questions that come our way. If you want to learn a little bit more about Triton, there's a link here that you can click on. It goes directly to underwater noise, but there's a lot of other stressor research that's happening in Triton, and I'd encourage you to go and visit the website. And my name and email are here if you want to reach out to me directly anytime. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Great presentation and giving us the nitty gritty of dealing with the Dash 40 and what it looks like in real time in the field. So thanks so much. We have some questions. I think we're going to save them for the end. They're not really clarifying questions. They're going to need a little more depth there. So I think we'll just go ahead with Doug's presentation. Next slide, please. Doug Gillespie is a acoustician with the Sea Mammal Research Unit at the University of St. Andrews, and he is going to talk about some of the collision risk work they've been doing. So please, Doug.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. Can you just wave, Andrea, if you can hear me clearly? Excellent. I'll bash straight on. So yeah, my name's Doug Gillespie. I work at the Sea Mammal Research Unit in St. Andrews, Scotland. I'm part of quite a large team now, so first of all, I must acknowledge my co-authors. And you'll also notice that my slides are not nearly as uniform and well organized as Joe's were. It's because I've stolen most of them from most of my colleagues, and I haven't particularly changed the styles of them. So let's crack on with the next slide. And I'll tell you, so most of the work that we've been doing, we are working with other people as well, but most of the work we've got data from is from the Maygen turbine site, which is up on the north coast of Scotland. If you've ever been to John O'Groats, it's just a couple of miles off John O'Groats in the bay between the mainland of Scotland and the Orkney Islands. And there, there's 4 turbine foundations were installed back in 2016. And these are large gravity mount foundations. You can see one of them here. It's 25 meters, it's triangular. It's 25 meters long and about 19 meters across. And as well as the large lump of yellow painted steel that you can see there, they put a couple of 100 tons. I can't remember if it's 1 200-ton ballast block or 2 200-ton ballast blocks at each end of those legs to keep the thing upright and stop it overturning in the water. So when they installed these back in 2016, we instrumented one of the turbine foundations with 12 passive acoustic hydrophones, and we integrated these directly onto the foundations of the turbine. So these hydrophones, they were sampled at very high sample rates, 500 kilohertz, and they made it possible for us to monitor all acoustically active cetacean species in the UK, which basically means the small cetaceans, primarily harbour porpoise and occasionally dolphins around. But there were no use for detecting the other marine mammals of interest in our waters, which is harbour and grey seals, because our seals very rarely vocalise underwater. But I must also say that this is on the back of some tagging studies which Joe Onofrio and Gordon Hastie had conducted around this time as well, where they're putting GPS telemetry tags on the seals, and they'd already shown that for seals there was actually some avoidance of the general area of the turbines once they were installed. Next slide, please. So I was just jabbing the forwards arrows on my keyboard, wondering why nothing was happening there. So we monitored that first system from 2017 through to about 2019 before it was decommissioned. And then in 2022, between 2022 and 2023, so it's basically from March 22 to March this year, we installed a separate platform, which contained 2 active sonar, and these are the Tritech Gemini sonars that you can see on the frame here, which are an imaging sonar. So if you're not familiar with these devices, the data they're giving you is very similar to what you get out of a radar display. So it's monitoring a 120-degree swath out to a distance of about 55 meters. And we had to install these on a platform 35 meters away from the turbine, so they could look back at the turbine itself. And we also had to put 2 of them in because the beam height of these sonars in the horizontal plane is only about 20 degrees. So it takes 2 of them to cover the full height of the turbine blade. So the turbines we're monitoring, again, I should say, they're about a 10-meter blade radius, a 20-meter blade diameter. Also on our platform was a smaller cluster of passive acoustic hydrophones, which can give bearings to animals. They can't provide 3D tracking. The frame's all shiny and new there. It was, we built this during the pandemic, and we're fortunate that we could test it on the dock in the village where I live. The base of that was filled with quite a lot of ballast to stop it, a couple of tons of ballast to stop it rolling away in the currents we're working in. So I know we can go to the next slide. Are these slides advancing automatically? Did I leave some timing?
They are, yes.
Yeah, sorry, it's my bad. I must have left the timing thing checked after I checked the length of the talk. That's fine. So acquisition and processing. For all of these things, we're interested in looking for rare events. You know, all of us are hoping that collisions or close interactions with turbines are rare events. So we're looking for events which may only happen, well, at most, once or twice a year. So we're really interested in persistent 24/7 monitoring over periods of several months. And the only way that we think we can achieve this is by getting power from the turbine and by sending our data back to shore via the turbine's optical fiber systems, so that we can achieve this monitoring without the need for kind of regular servicing intervals to download data and charge batteries of a more autonomous system. So all of the data was streamed back to a PC in the turbine substation, where sometimes we process the data in real time, sometimes we just archive the data to hard drives. There's very poor internet to the substation. The entire turbine industry of the major turbine industry of the UK seems to run itself over a 4G cell phone network. So we couldn't download data directly, so data had to be recovered by post. We did, as I said, we did a certain amount of real-time processing with the PAMGuard acoustic software that I developed over the years, but we also did a lot of data archiving. The sonar data were collected exclusively with the sonar manufacturer's software, then processed offline back at our lab. But this system did allow us very persistent 24/7 monitoring. I think over the first 450 days of passive acoustic data collection between 2017 and 2019, we lost about 3 days due to a technical issue with the software. We collected over 360 days of sonar and PAM data between 2022 and 23, again, with very few hiccups in the system. But to make the system work, I think the key take-home message is it required a lot of work on our part, but actually huge amounts of work with the turbine industry. So in the photo on the bottom right, this is days before installation of the first turbine foundations. And half the people in that photo were working for the turbine company. Half of us were working for the universities, integrating our system together to, I think actually in that photograph, myself and the engineer with the red boiler suit on were re-crimping one of the Ethernet cables because it had been done up wrong. And then also required the turbine company to spend quite a lot of money on extremely expensive underwater mateable, ROV mateable connectors that you can see in the top right there. Okay, so next slide, please. So from the passive acoustic results from 2017 to 2019, this is all published in a couple of papers. If you search for my name or any of the other author names on this presentation, you should be able to find these papers quite easily, and they're all open access, so you don't have to pay anything for them. We studied the data at 2 scales, really. First of all, we just looked for broad scale changes in presence of porpoises when the turbine was operating. So this was an analysis led by Laura Palmer, and she showed that when the turbine was operating at high rotation speeds or high water flows, then porpoise presence around the turbine, after we'd corrected for noise and all sorts of things like that, which could mess the data up, we were up to 78% less likely to encounter porpoises close to the turbine. And she also found that when all of the turbines in the array were operational, because this is experimental turbines, there were times when no turbines were operating, there were times when all four were operating. So it gave us quite a good data set of turbine on and turbine off. We could study from those data, we could learn that was quite a significant reduction in porpoise presence in the general area. So we go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. We also found when we looked at the very fine scale distribution of porpoise, localized porpoise clicks close to the turbine, we found that the animals that were still near the turbine were clearly avoiding the rotating turbine blades. So again, this plot's a little bit unclear. It's clearer in the papers. It's got better explanation in the paper than I'll give you now. But if you imagine the circle in that this is a series of slices in front of the turbine, and all of the data have been rotated. So whichever way the turbine is facing, it's always looking in to the turbine. And the disc represents the sort of danger area of the rotors. And if you look sort of 25 to 30 meters in front of the turbine, you can see that porpoises are distributed throughout the water column. And as you get closer and you get to this bit in the middle where you're just 5 meters in front of the turbine or a few meters behind the turbine, there's no clicks localized in that area at all, because most of the clicks seem to be down near the foundation and they're not going anywhere near the particularly dangerous bit of the turbine. And in that 450 days of monitoring, so that's just about well over a year's data, we found that only a single porpoise track seemed to pass through what we call the rotor swept area, the danger area of the turbine. Then again, when we looked and checked the times of the data, the turbine wasn't rotating at the time. So we think that in over a year's data collection, no porpoises had an adverse interaction with that turbine foundation. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, please. So what we're doing now, we're certainly interested in porpoises, but the species of main interest at the turbine site up there is probably harbour seals, which are in decline due to various other stresses on them. So we've been studying these with the Tritech multi-beam sonars. Now I know several groups are using these. They're a relatively new technology. I think my colleague Gordon Hasty's been messing around with them for a decade or more, and there's a number of papers about how he's been using them to track seals. The models we're using on this particular installation are the 720 IS, I believe, but we've also bought some of the newer 1200 IK models, which are smaller and fortunately a lot cheaper. So these monitor 120 degree swathe out to about, and we find we can, well, Gordon has shown that we can detect seals reliably out to about 50 meters, and they have a few centimeters resolution. It's very, very high resolution data. It's a high frequency at 720 kilohertz, so most of the signal is well above the hearing threshold of most marine mammals. And again, empirical studies have shown that these sonars don't appear to disturb seals, and have also got some porpoise tracks very close to the sonars. Though there are some lower sidebands from these pulses, which are probably audible to the animals, but we haven't seen adverse responses, unlike with some other devices. So the nice thing about these is they can detect and track silent animals. If an animal's there, it will be detected. So it's not like a porpoise where actually, if the animal goes quiet and you don't hear it, there could be a quiet animal there. We found at the start of the project, the manufacturer's software that we were planning to use for data collection and sort of semi-automatic processing of the data couldn't handle the movements of the turbine. It created so many thousands of false detections per second, more or less. It was quite ridiculous. The software became quite unstable. So all we were able to do on this study was to archive the data to hard drives, ship them back to St Andrews, and we developed our own track detection algorithms as a new plugin to the Panguard software, which allowed a reasonably, I've said it, oh, sorry, backwards, please, my bad, allowed a reasonably efficient combination of automatic processing with manual validation. So if you're unfamiliar with Panguard, this is open source software that was, actually a lot of it was funded by the offshore oil industry for detecting and tracking marine mammals using passive acoustics in the vicinity of seismic vessels, and it was relatively easy to adapt the software or make new modules for it, which can also do sonar processing. That's right. Now, next slide, please. Great. So what the data look like, I think you can see this quite clearly. You can see in the middle of the image, the one on the right, the higher sonar, is actually the lower sonar, which is pointing more towards the turbine foundation. And you can see the triangular base, and you can see the outlines of the fronts of the big ballast blocks that stop it getting tumbled away in the current. And you can probably see just to the left of the central tower, you can see some movements, which is the rotation of the turbine blades. Then you can see two very, very clear targets swimming from left to right across the sonar image. Now, you can't really identify the species from an image this far out, but the software allows us to easily zoom in, check out the images, and we're very confident that that's a couple of seals swimming by. Thank you, sorry. So watching seal videos when seals are going by is all good and fun, but when you've got 24 hours a day of this stuff and you've been collecting data for over a year, watching the video is not an option. So if we have the next slide, please. Thank you. So the track detection algorithm allows you to display tracks over about 15 minutes of data at a time. And again, clearly you can see on the image on the right, the colored boxes are the positions where those two seals swam by, also getting a lot of false detections from the turbine rotors. But it's very simple now for an operator to kind of flick through these data 15 minutes at a time. When they see something of interest, they'll zoom in, check the species ID, play it backwards and forwards as video, put a box around it, and they can mark it as a seal or whatever else they think it is. Now, the algorithm was kept deliberately very, very simple because until we know more about what the animals are looking like on these images, we didn't want to miss anything. So I wasn't particularly trying to not detect the turbine blades. I was really focusing on having a general detector to guide the eye and allow the human to get through the data in a reasonable time. And with this system, we find that a human can get through 24 hours of data in 2 or 3 hours work. So it's been quite onerous, but we're just coming to the end of the data set in the next week or so. It has been possible. Okay, so next slide, please. We're also seeing a lot of other stuff on the sonar. Obviously, it detects everything that moves through there. So some of the species that we've been seeing are obviously quite a lot of seals and marine mammals. So to date, of the 266 days of data that I have in this table, we have got a little bit more now. I think we're at over 300, but some of these results have just been submitted in a sort of methods paper describing how the system works. We're at 359 marine mammal tracks. That's over 1 marine mammal per day going quite close to the turbine. We also get huge numbers of fish schools going through the system. So we're up in the thousands of those, 10 times as many. So you're talking about 20 fish schools a day going through there by the looks of things. Thousands and thousands of individual fish. A lot of diving birds appearing in the sonar images. A lot of unidentified stuff. There's a lot of small targets. You're seeing a dot going by. It's definitely too small to be a marine mammal, so it's not our primary concern, but we don't know what it is. So overall, our humans, our wonderful team that we've got here in St Andrews, have marked out over 14,000 animal tracks in these data. And the highlights are things that appear to be sharks, sharky, fish schools, and also quite large numbers. I can't remember what the actual numbers are. Quite large numbers of very rectangular kind of skate-like animals in the data as well. Okay, so we're just coming to the end of the sort of main picking out the tracks, and we're just starting to parameterize these tracks now to look at avoidance responses around the turbine. So can I have the next slide, please? So what we're doing at the moment is, to say, the main thing we're working on now is extracting kind of track metrics to parameterize avoidance response for the seals. When you look at the tracks, a lot of the ones, like the ones I showed you there, they just swim happily past the turbine. They weren't actually that close to the blades. Everything was fine. I don't think the turbine was rotating very much then anyway. We have got other tracks where the animals are clearly approaching the turbine while it's rotating, and they clearly change direction. So we're counting those tracks and we're parameterizing them, and we're looking at any close interactions that we see. And we're hoping to get, well, actually we're contracted by the Scottish Government. So of course we're going to, if there's anyone from the Scottish Government listening, we will be getting reports and papers out on that in the first half of next year. Obviously, the processing, we've got it down to the point where we can do it. You know, I think if you had to watch all of the video, you'd be spending several days per day's data. We've got it down to a couple of hours. But there's a lot of scope for improving these algorithms. And now we've got this big database of verified tracks by the humans. We're starting to work on machine learning algorithms, and we're starting to work on other heuristic algorithms, which can better identify these tracks and initially reduce the amount of effort by humans. But then also our ultimate goal is to really get this to the point where we can use it for real-time monitoring with a minimum of human intervention. Okay. To do that, one of the things we'll probably be doing over the next year or so is trying to get better sonar ground truth data, perhaps with cameras. If anyone's got data, we're very interested in data sharing because we think this is a big problem. We've got some regulators in the world interested in real-time mitigation. So again, we need to, once we've got the algorithms working to a high degree of accuracy, we're looking at firing acoustic deterrents. Some people are talking about slowing down turbines. I think from an engineering perspective, that's going to be extremely challenging to make a decision about the presence of a marine mammal, and to get a turbine to slow down within a few seconds is going to be not one of the hardest things we've taken on, I think. But the thing that's really also taxing us that we like to think about, things like that are difficult. What we're all starting to think about as well, and I know people were discussing this on Tuesday, is array scale monitoring. You know, we monitored a turbine twice. We've got about 800 days of data, and it was quite hard work. So we obviously don't want to monitor. People are talking about putting out 20 turbines in this area, or a dozen turbines in this area. Clearly, we don't want to be monitoring a dozen turbines or 20 turbines. For a start, we'll die of exhaustion. Secondly, it's a massive cost to the industry. But how many of these turbines do we really need to monitor? Do we continue to monitor one turbine? Do we focus on the gaps between turbines and see what's going on there? Because we do need to understand how these arrays are going to, you know, we need to understand the fine scale behavior, and that if an animal runs away from one turbine, is there a risk of it going into another one when the turbines are much closer together? And of course, we need to look at those sort of broader scale possible barrier effects. Are we going to start excluding animals from that whole area? So now that the industry is really starting to move forwards and starting to think about arrays, certainly in the UK they are at the moment, we need to really start addressing these questions. Clearly better processing, which I'm very confident we'll have within the next sort of months to years, will allow us to do more processing, more monitoring more easily. But how much do we really have to do to answer the questions? So final slide, please, and Michaela. Thank you. So there's a number of papers out describing the methods. Again, you can find all these just by Googling my name or Gordon Hastie's name. The last one of those was only submitted a couple of weeks ago, so that won't be out for a while, but that's describing the sonar processing methods we've got. Then there's a couple of results papers out, again, describing the results of the passive acoustic studies that we've been doing. And all of this work was funded, a lot of it by Marine Scotland or the Scottish Government, also with some support from the UK funding councils. The main thing is it would not have been possible without a lot of cooperation, a lot of hard cash as well for buying expensive connectors and putting systems in the water, but a lot of effort really on the part of Maygen, the turbine company that we're working with. So if you have any questions, obviously we've got half an hour or so to chat now. Otherwise, feel free to get in touch. I'm quite easy to find. Final thing, all our software is open source, by the way, GPL3, so help yourself to it. That's me. Thank you.
Fantastic, Doug. Thank you so much. A pair of really, really good presentations. So we have a number of questions, but please, if you have questions, go on putting them in, preferably in the Q&A, but the chat is okay too. So I think we'll start with a couple of questions for Joe, some of which have been answered, but I think would be interesting for the whole group. And that is about the IEC-40 standard. Is it publicly available? And another question associated with that is, how well were you able to follow the -40 with the drifting hydrophone system?
Yeah, so the -40 is publicly available. You can purchase it if you just Google search IEC, the title of it, it'll pop up, and it's available for purchase through the IEC website. And then for the Dash 40 with the drifting hydrophone system, PNNL was not operating. We weren't doing the drifting work. That was University of Washington. And I think they were working with Integral for a short period early on in the deployment. And they, the Dash 40 for a drifting system is actually probably a little bit simpler. So I think they were pretty easy to adhere to it, because you can put that system, since it's very mobile, into the measurement zones pretty easy, and make those characteristic measurements around a WEC pretty quickly with a drifting system. So the bottom mounted stuff is a little trickier because you have to place them accurately on the seafloor, which is not always not always a trivial exercise with heavy equipment and rolling waves and things like that. So,
Joe, do you want to say a little bit about the moving the Dash 40 from a technical specification to a standard, and some of those challenges associated with it, say around turbines?
yeah, that's great, Andrew. Good question there. And so there's a maintenance team with the technical specification right now, and we have exercised the Dash 40 in a few instances with WECs and turbines. And so now we have some recommendations coming in from experts that have been applying it, and we'll be making a few changes with the maintenance team, and then hopefully moving that toward getting an accredited standard out there with the Dash 40. So then when devices come in, they can actually get an accreditation for the Dash 40 survey measurements. So yeah, there were some challenges, right? Anytime you have a new technical specification, some things work and some things don't. And so it took some adjustments, and we think we've got some good modifications to make it a little more flexible. I remember, Brian Pelagi was the main author of that. Went out with Brian in the field, and first day around a turbine, and he was commenting about, oh well, we broke the standard right off, or we broke the technical specification right out of the gate. So yeah, definitely takes some iteration to get it to the point where it's working seamlessly. So
Great, thank you. We've got a couple of questions for Doug. Question about, if you're using the active sonar in the particular frequencies you are, is there the chance this will disturb other marine mammals, other than your target species?
Okay, thanks. It's a very good question. So the sonar's operating at 720 kilohertz. So that's several octaves above the highest hearing that we know about in any known marine mammal. So harbor porpoise is the highest frequency marine mammal, and its biosonar works up to about 150 kilohertz. So we're not aware of any marine animal that could hear at that frequency. However, when you produce a pulse, when you make a pulsed sound, even if the pulse is at 720 kilohertz, it does produce some slightly lower sidebands. Now, they contain a very small percentage of the total energy in the pulse, but that initial pulse is pretty loud, so there is some energy there. And clearly, they are audible to marine mammals. Like, I get really annoying interference from that sonar on my passive acoustic hydrophones. It's not super loud, but I can hear it. And if I can hear it, I can guarantee that a porpoise can hear it, because they're much better at their job than I am. Okay, so yes, I think animals could hear it, but Gordon Hastie did a number of studies with a number of different sonars, and he showed that this particular sonar is shaping the pulse of their wave quite well, and the sidebands are quite small, and it did not appear to disturb seals in the studies that he conducted. Okay, so if you follow up his references, I can't remember exactly which paper it is, you'll find results on that. And my understanding is that wasn't the same for every sonar that we tested, where there was significantly more energy in these lower sidebands, and some of them did cause disturbance. Okay,
Great point.
Question?
Yes, and I think part of the outcome of that is what instrument you use really matters. and with your populations. And these are the kinds of things that sharing among the research community are really vital. So I would encourage people to read the whole series of SMRU papers. Another question for you, Doug. You mentioned as you were wrapping up that some of the things we might be able to use at a practical level for keeping animals out of turbines or away from turbines might be to use acoustic deterrents. Can you talk a little bit about what's available, and can you characterize them of how they might keep animals away, but also be considered an annoyance or harassment of marine mammals?
Absolutely. So this is not my main area of expertise. I'm on the peripherals, being the person who's going to fire these things off. But the main acoustic deterrents which are being considered are basically seal harassment devices designed for keeping seals away from fish farms. They're the obvious choice, and some colleagues have been testing a device for dolphins to check it works with those. Now, the idea is that yes, you want to disturb the marine mammal, definitely. That's the purpose of it. So the whole kind of point really is you want to cause some disturbance so the animals go around the turbine. That is disturbance, but you don't want to disturb them so much that they leave the entire area. So you don't particularly want to put an acoustic harassment device on all the time and just turn it on 24/7, because yes, that is going to cause environmental impact. We don't want to do that. And secondly, their effectiveness may decline over time. So by having an acoustic deterrent which is fired by some kind of automatic sonar detection system, you will reduce the times at which that needs to be used and reduce the environmental impact, and hopefully also increase its effectiveness. Okay, but also say that it's very difficult detecting animals in real time, and there will be false detections. But I would say that it's better to make a few false firings of an acoustic deterrent per day is much better than leaving it on continuously. And the cost of doing that is also very, very low. So it's a small amount of power, and I would argue it's quite a small environmental impact, probably smaller than having the turbine there in the first place. The only other possible mitigation that I can think of is to shut down the turbine. You've got two problems with that. One is just mechanically, it's very, very hard to stop a turbine. There's a huge amount of momentum. And when I've spoken to engineers and said, how quickly can your brake operate? They're going to go, you've got to be joking, Doug. I've seen an analogy. It's like if you imagine a 20-ton truck driving down a steep hill and slamming the brakes on and trying to stop within sort of 5 meters. It's not going to happen easily. Okay. And also, obviously, there's a cost in it. It's more expensive engineering to prepare it. And every time they do that, they're going to lose electricity generation. So there's quite a significant cost in that one. But I think if they're effective, the cost of an acoustic deterrent is quite low environmentally. Obviously, people can argue about that one. And it's very low financially. On the other hand, though, I'll just add to that, like the measurements that we've been making of the turbine noise in Scotland, there's a couple of excellent papers by Denise Riche from the Scottish Association of Marine Science. These turbines are noisy. The turbine we've been monitoring, we could hear it a couple of kilometers away. Yeah. Closer to, there's also a 20 kilohertz noise, which is quite strong from some of the turbines, which is some kind of generator whine. But we wouldn't notice it. It's above our hearing range, but it's well into the hearing range of marine mammals. So I think it's almost impossible for marine mammals to be anywhere near these things and not know that they're there. So, but on the other hand, there's a lot more environmental noise. There's a lot of flow noise, there's a lot of things. Maybe they can't get them. We don't know. It's
the turbine is its own acoustic deterrent, right?
Well, there's two things. Like with fishing nets, people talk about acoustic alerting, which is just helping an animal know that the net's there. So for a gill net, which is very hard to see on an animal's biosonar, it helps the animal know that it's there. There's an acoustic deterrent, which makes the environment just so unpleasant that the animal moves away. So it's definitely alerting the animals. Whether or not it's loud enough to be a deterrence, I'm not sure. I wouldn't like to say.
Great. Oh, great discussion around that, Doug, because I think this is a real interest. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask a question real quick, Doug. As far as the signal characteristic for a deterrent, I've heard discussion around using predatory calls And I was just wondering how you feel about that. Like, so for here on the west coast of the U.S., gray whales are a concern around some things, and some people have talked about using an acoustic deterrent that's mimicking orca, killer whales, which are a predator for them. I don't know. I mean, environmentally speaking,
I've got no expertise in that area, so I wouldn't want to comment. Really,
okay.
It's in this realm of you want to disturb the animal, but as little as possible. But you definitely want to disturb it a bit. So
wake them up.
Achieves that.
Yeah, great discussion, guys. Just for the interest of those on the phone, online, the US under the Marine Mammal Protection Act makes it really difficult to get a permit to put any kind of acoustic deterrent in place. And that's where Joe mentions the predator calls. This has been tried. For example, we have seals outside Seattle who sit at the locks waiting for, and also down the Columbia River, waiting for salmon to come through. It's just like they have this little slot of food coming at them. And they've tried all kinds of things, and including removing the animals, taking them way down the coast, and they come right back. And they've tried underwater deterrents, I know, predator calls and so on, but I don't know how systematically it's been done. So it's in a very interesting sort of way to think about these. So I need to say that on the screen right now, there is a QR code. If people online would grab that and take our little survey, it's very helpful to us to know what you think of these webinars and topics you'd like to hear in future. So if you can do that for us, that would be wonderful. In the meantime, we have another question for Joe. Now I have to find it again. Joe, did you actually listen to the data around CalWave to qualitatively assess what was making the noise? Was it clanking chains or the generator parts, etc.?
Yeah, so we did do that. And we have, like I was mentioning, and that'll be in our paper, we have a nice little library of sounds, characteristic sounds, both the spectral signature of them. And we did have a little bit of chain clanking, but it was there was very distinctive WEC type signals that would kind of emerge during particular wave conditions. So we'd see the WEC making sounds that were very characteristic over periods when the waves were in one wave state and the device was generating power in that power generation state. It had a characteristic acoustic emission. So I think that's really valuable from a developer's perspective, and also from an environmental perspective of just knowing, being able to tie that to it. That's a thing in the -40 we're really still working on. It's an active area of research, is how you tease out the actual noise from the WEC from all the other contributing sources. Sometimes it's not very easy, or a turbine, for that matter. And that's something that folks are looking at actively, of developing methodology around how to do that. So yes, we did do that, and it's fun to listen to different things and guess what the different sources are.
Joe, when you say WEC noises, are you talking about the generator, or are you talking about a sort of a slap? Because that was a point absorber, right?
It's both. We have sort of both. We had some like striking kind of sounds that were coming from it a little bit, and then we also had sort of something that sounded a little bit more like the power takeoff. All pretty low frequency though, all down in the sub couple kilohertz range. So nothing like alarming at all, but yeah, it was one of the first WECs I've been around that I could actually there was signal to really to go after. So
great. In the question and answer box, there are some useful bits of information. Carol Sparling of SMRU has noted that they've been testing various kinds of acoustic deterrents, including one that does a physiological startle response rather than just a loud, annoying sound. So I think that's really interesting. And they've been working on that also using seals with killer whale or orca calls. So I think this is an active area of interest. And Colleen Weiler says that they have been looking at more active acoustic deterrents in the locks outside Seattle, the Ballard locks, where we've had these California sea lions having their way with the endangered salmon and steelhead runs. There's a note, a comment rather than a question again on this idea of acoustic deterrent is how what is the concern that animals may become habituated to these kinds of noises and therefore potentially more vulnerable to predation? I guess there's not much we can do that we don't muck with one way or another. So let's see, what else have we got here? Emma Cotter has also noted in the chat another study on the audibility of the Gemini to marine mammals. That's in the chat. There is a couple of other questions here that are actually not addressed to you guys that I'll quickly just go over. I'm not sure if everybody's seeing everything in the chat. So these slides will be available. This whole thing is recorded. It will be available later on. Everybody who registered for the webinar, whether you made it here today or not, will get a link to be able to download those. There's also a question about, wait, I lost it. This whole idea that we're now talking a lot about monitoring and research and analysis to help projects avoid and minimize environmental effects. But what about mitigation? And we've talked a little bit about that. And Doug was really good about talking about the challenges of shutting down turbines. I think very early in this industry, there was a lot of talk thrown around that they could shut down turbines in real time. And I think a lot of us wanted to believe that early on, but it's been shown that, as Doug pointed out with his analogy, it's really difficult to do and probably damaging to the equipment, certainly takes away from power generation. The one thing that I would like to note is if you go to TETHIS, there is a monitoring management measures tool that has a listing of all the mitigation measures we have been able to pull out of licenses worldwide that have been tried. Some of them are quite wacky, but but they were asked for and proven to not be either doable or effective. So those are probably worth looking at too, and those are all documented there. So okay, yeah, Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that in terms of stopping turbines, a better option would seem to be rotating the blades. Most of these turbines have variable pitch blades, and you probably couldn't stop it dead that way, but you might slow it enough. Just when you do the maths, our sonar system's detecting out to, say, 55 meters. We probably need a good 20 meters of track to say, hey, wow, this is a marine mammal coming in. Let's be optimistic and say we do it in 10 meters. So we've got 40 meters upstream. Water's flowing at 5 meters per second. 40 divided by 5, we've got 8 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's pretty, you say that to an engineer, they kind of look at you and go, yeah, should we go to the pub?
With about a 20-second error bar around it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, at least with the sonar, you know where it is, but you've got, we're working in some of the highest currents in the world. So if the animal's moving with the current, it's going pretty fast. You've got very, very little time to have enough track to make a detection and enough processor time to make a decision, then get that into the turbine and do something. It's really challenging.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But it also really argues for why we, the biologists, need and acousticians need to work with the engineers to see what is feasible, how these systems can be put together, et cetera. It's only through a really multidisciplinary approach we're going to solve this. And I know at one point, Doug, you alluded to the fact that I think it was about the deterrence, having some kind of a handoff from one instrument to another, being able to trigger. You guys have been talking about obviously acoustics, but there is a lot of use of underwater cameras these days. And some locations it's very feasible, others not so much because the water's turbid, et cetera. But again, this idea of being able to hand off from acoustic to optical instruments, et cetera, is probably where we're going to find some of these solutions. I'd love to have both of you weigh in a little more. Doug did talk about what do we do when we go from these single devices to arrays. Joe, from what you've measured around WEX, how do we go from measuring and really characterizing one device? How do we think about this when suddenly, let's say, CalWave puts in 20? What do we think about this?
Where I would start is with the modeling, right? I would multi-source modeling, and then do some validation around that with measurements. And I think that's probably going to be the most cost effective, way to move out that way. Acoustics is tricky though, right? The models are hard, especially in complex environments like that. So I like I said, I think I would start there, but it may require, certainly more sensors, right? You're going to have to get a lot more sensors out and around an array. I think that's sort of the approach I've been sort of heading down, moving up toward arrays. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. So that's a tricky question. So
yeah. Well, it's the one we're all starting to face. We actually held a workshop at UTEC, European Wave Tidal Energy Conference, a couple of weeks ago in Spain, where we asked this question of a number of experts, and we'll have a report out on that up on TETHIS before too long. It's obviously very opinion based at this point, but there's a lot of people thinking around these lines.
Yeah, and then the question of like having what's the acoustic disturbance within the array versus outside of the array, and what sort of footprint do you have? Yeah, there's a lot of nuance to it, I think.
Yeah, and then we have to think like the animal. That's the other tough one. Doug, do you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to say Denise Riche at SAMS has been doing a lot of modelling on this as well, and taking the measurements from the 2 turbines in Scotland that we've measured noise for, and saying what would happen when this was scaled up to an array. I'm just trying to check the status of that publication. It's I don't think it's actually out yet, but it's work that people are doing in terms of understanding the noise.
And as you alluded to, Doug, the collision risk one is probably even a thornier one. Are we really going to instrument multiple turbines in an array forever? It's a really tough one. Just a couple of other questions that came in that I did answer, but there was a question about availability of data from any of these studies. And I can only answer it from the US side of it, where we are required using public funds to make all data available. There's sometimes a little bit of a lag. Well, data are obviously QC'd and used for publications, but I've posted in the answered questions, the link where at least the US data all go. Doug, do you want to talk a little bit about that, say from the UK perspective?
Yeah, I might get Carol to wade in on this, but we're generally up for sharing our data, and most of the costs of our data collection has been funded by the governments, and they'd want it shared. A lot of it comes down to a practical problem. This is high resolution data. So our sonar data generates 300 gigabytes of raw data a day. So that's a 10 terabyte hard drive every month. And it's quite hard to get that up on the server and download it. I've got crates of hard drives in my office, so you're kind of welcome to it, but copying it's going to take a lot of time and money. So
yeah, well, I'll just take the opportunity to tout the primer program in the US a little bit, where we've brought together the databases, also things like TETHIS and various other knowledge bases, and everything. And the data side of it is run by one of the other national labs. Everything has gone to cloud-based, and they've got quite a sophisticated system. I'm a PI on that project too, but not being a data scientist, I'm pretty ignorant about it. But they've got some very nice streamlined ways of getting things into the various clouds, all of the 3 big cloud servers, services, and we have been holding international data sharing workshops once a year, trying to see if we can get other countries sort of integrated databases. So we're always really interested in that. We can't take everybody's data, but we do have a lot of best practices and APIs set up for sharing of the data. So
yeah, it's what I hope to do. It's like all of our raw data. I think if you're a developer, certain developers who are interested in sort of testing for false alarms might want all of the data. What I'm hoping to do is produce a reduced data set, which is just the stuff when I had a track. But you've got to remember that if you're using that for developing your own algorithm, it's the stuff where Doug's algorithm worked. And if you want to find stuff that I didn't find, that's not particularly helpful to you, because, you know, I live in hope that someone much cleverer than me will come along and take my job sometime in the next few years. So there's disadvantages to doing that, but it is much more practical because it'll only be 1% of the data volume. You're talking, you know, a few terabytes rather than 100 terabytes. 100 terabytes does get expensive.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And if you've got interest in that, we can certainly hook you up with the NREL folks they've got some very clever ways that Amazon Web Services and Google and so on actually pay to host our data. So that's because I agree with you. Getting the data products up is the first most important one, but access to the raw data, other than having to go into your closet with the hard drives, is a great way to go. Okay, let's see. The only other question, oh, wait a second. I'm going back and forth to the chat. Okay, Doug, can you talk a little bit about the flow noise challenge with the turbine mounted PAM systems? Did it affect your efforts, or were you focused on species vocalization above the range affected by the flow noise?
Oh no, the flow noise was at all frequencies, Joe. The flow noise went right up into the many tens of kilohertz and affected detectability. So there's quite a lot of information on this in the Laura Palmer paper. If you just Google Laura Palmer, Doug Gillespie, you'll find it, and you'll see what we actually did in the analysis. We spent a long time thinking about how much more detectable animals were at low flow when it's a lot quieter than at high flow, and how to correct for that. And you're thinking, are we dealing with a linear system of animals going through? Are we dealing with a square law system of the detection range, or is it cubic? And we tied ourselves in knots and decided we could put any correction factor we wanted to in if we weren't careful. And so what we did in the end was we just actually applied a very high constant detection threshold. So we threw away 90% of our detections from the quieter times and said we're only dealing with the loud ones, which we think we would have heard anyway. And we based most of our analysis on that. And similarly, I'm just in possession of a whole lot of sound trap data actually from a tidal area somewhere else in the UK that we're working at. And I see, I can't remember, it's about 25, 30 dB difference in noise levels and detectability between slack and peak flow.
Yep.
So yes, if you just do a raw analysis, you find you get loads more animals when there's slack water. But when you flatten it out by kind of throwing away all the quiet stuff, which you wouldn't hear when it's noisy, then you have got enough data left, and you see a very different distribution.
Okay. Nice.
Great. Wonderful. Great discussion.
Thanks. Yeah.
One last question that I did answer here, but for there was a question about whether changes in current patterns were being considered. Are we only sort of interested in animals? And in fact, we are looking at changes in oceanographic systems, whether it's wave heights or changes in current from taking energy out, from changing circulation. And we have looked at this extensively, but at this point, with only a few devices in the water, it's really the numerical models that inform us, the hydrodynamic models. And maybe someday we will have to look at this from a field perspective as we get huge arrays. However, these are very high energetic areas, and finding any signal against the natural variability is pretty tough. But I think that also is, at some point in the distant future, the idea of being able to bring those hydrodynamic models back with some of these models of animal movement, especially as we get to smaller things like small fish and so on, is sort of the pipe dream that we hope we'll get to at some point. Okay, I think we've answered all the questions, and we're coming up on our time. I really want to thank both Joe and Doug for great presentations, but also great discussion and thoughtful ideas of how we move forward with this industry, because it is us, the research community, that are, I think, are going to enable the effective movement of licenses and permitting and consenting and so on. So I would ask that if you would take our survey, that would be great, because we'd love to know what you'd like to hear from, who you'd like to hear from next. And with that, just great thanks to our presenters, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. Yep.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.